Mr. Julian, seconded by Ms. Moore, Abitibi-Temiskaming, moves that in the opinion of the House, the Keystone XL pipeline would intensify the export of unprocessed raw bitumen and would export more than 40,000 well-paying Canadian jobs and is therefore not in Canada's best interests. Debate. The Honourable Member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise in the House to speak to this motion. I'd like to just preface my remarks by talking a bit about my past, Mr. Speaker. As you well know, I used to work in one of the now closed oil refineries in this country, the Shelburne refinery in Burnaby, British Columbia. And as a result of that, having worked with oil, having had as part of my job cleaning out the oil tanks that were there at the Shelburne refinery, I've developed a very healthy respect for that substance. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you're aware, when you're cleaning out oil tanks, you need oxygen tanks, you need full safety equipment. If the safety equipment malfunctions or if the oxygen tanks run out, you're not around anymore, Mr. Speaker. So that degree of danger and that healthy respect for a substance that can bring some benefit, but of course as well can bring some danger, is something that I'd like to bring to the debate. I'd like to say as well, just to start off, Mr. Speaker, that when we're talking today, we're talking about Keystone, of course, and value-added jobs. We're also talking, though, about this government's lack of action on climate change and the environment. Mr. Speaker, that's part of the ongoing narrative. And as President Obama said so well, and he's looking at Keystone, he said that this government, this Conservative government, simply has to start taking environmental measures. And as we'll see later on, Mr. Speaker, Canada is beyond being a climate change laggard. We are among the worst of the 60 countries that are annually surveyed on climate change. 58, Mr. Speaker, 58th place out of 61 countries. I mean, it shows an appalling lack of leadership and an appalling lack of responsibility by the part of this government. So there are environmental issues that we'll be bringing to the fore throughout the course of today when we're debating this issue. There's also the economic issues that I'll come back to in a moment. And, of course, safety issues, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that I'll be pointing out in my 20 minutes is to talk about the fact that under the Conservatives, it's not only increasing danger in our railway system, and that has been sadly and tragically underscored by the appalling devastation in Lac-Mégantic. Mr. Speaker, in pipeline management as well, under this Conservative government, we have seen a steadily increasing number of pipeline leaks and pipeline spills. In fact, a doubling over the last few years on this Conservative watch. So when we're talking about the issue of Keystone, we're talking about value-added jobs, of course, but we're also talking about a complete abdication of responsibility by this government on the environment and on climate change, and also on pipeline safety. And I think those are important issues to bring to the fore. Now, Mr. Speaker, I referenced earlier that I'm a refinery worker. I also would like to just flag that on natural resources issues generally, this Conservative government has been appallingly bad. Now, Mr. Speaker, I represent the riding of Burnaby, New Westminster. And as an elected representative there, many of my friends, I went to high school in New Westminster, the New Westminster Secondary School, HIACS, and my friends after high school went into the softwood lumber industry. Well, Mr. Speaker, they worked at the three plants that existed there, Interfor, Canfor, Western Forest Products in New Westminster. Hundreds of good, well-paying jobs, thousands of indirect jobs that depended on the softwood industry. And all of that was eviscerated and evaporated overnight, Mr. Speaker, when this government irresponsibly signed the softwood lumber agreement, the softwood lumber sellout. Within a matter of weeks, Interfor, Canfor, and Western Forest Products. Now, we have Conservatives laughing at the loss of jobs, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, but I think we should be standing up for the workers rather than having Conservatives laugh at the loss of jobs, 2,000 indirect jobs lost as a result of the signature of that agreement, Mr. Speaker. Now, they may laugh that those families, many of whom I went to high school with, that those families had to cobble together a couple of part-time jobs. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, the one hope that they have is looking to 2015 and looking to the election of an NDP government that is actually going to take workers seriously, Mr. Speaker. So, having seen firsthand in my community the devastation wrought by the incredible irresponsibility of this government, signing an agreement that they hadn't even read, that they didn't even understand. And the NDP certainly raised this issue consistently in the House. I saw firsthand in the natural resources sector the loss of jobs that eventually, as you know, Mr. Speaker, went to about 60,000 manufacturing and value-added jobs that were lost in the softwood lumber industry following that agreement. Now, Mr. Speaker, when we look at that, when we look at the actual loss of jobs in smelting and refining, even in the mining industry, Mr. Speaker, it's a source of real concern. Because, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the number of mining and quarrying jobs has gone up over the last few years, but Statistics Canada tells us that the number of jobs lost in the smelting and refining sector, when we're talking about mining, actually has gone far beyond any gain of jobs in mining and quarrying. So when we look at the lumber industry, we look at the mining industry, and now looking at the energy industry, this has been a dismal period for working families, Mr. Speaker. There is absolutely no doubt. So we have to come back to, then, the issue of the energy industry. They messed up in these two other areas. Why would they be pushing Keystone, which results, as you know, Mr. Speaker, in a loss of value-added jobs? Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll start off by saying two things, two undeniable facts, and a third one that really impacts on Canadian working families. The first undeniable fact, of course, Mr. Speaker, under this government, we've lost 500,000 value-added manufacturing jobs. That's a simple fact. It's undisputed. Even the Conservatives admit to it. They say, well, we've given a few part-time service jobs, so that must compensate. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, 500,000 value-added manufacturing jobs lost on this watch, the watch of the Conservative government, is undeniably a sign of failure. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, it's our current account deficit, because what we're doing increasingly, Mr. Speaker, is actually exporting raw materials and importing the value-added products and the manufacturing products overseas. Now, in 2011, that deficit on current accounts was $49 billion, Mr. Speaker, and it gets worse. Last year, it went to $62 billion. Now, that is a record. We've never had a deficit that large in our nation's history. And that, of course, is directly related to this government's failure on value-added jobs. It's failure to understand that you actually need coherent policies. You actually need to put in place those policies to ensure that Canadians actually get to work. Now, Mr. Speaker, the third point that I'd like to make, and the third undeniable statistic, is that the working families across this country, so many of whom are represented by NDP MPs in this Parliament, are now struggling under a record debt load. Like a debt load, a burden that we have never seen in our history, Mr. Speaker. It's actually highest in Alberta. And so those working families that are struggling under a burden of massive debt because they have seen a real erosion in real income at the same time as expenses continue to climb is something that is extremely germane to this debate. We're talking about Canadians over the last 7 years getting poorer and poorer and poorer and more in debt every year that the Conservatives are in power. So, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about value-added jobs, we're talking about something that has a profound impact on the quality of life of ordinary families right across this country. So, here we have failure of the Conservative government in a whole range of sectors, failure to create value-added jobs, failure to create manufacturing jobs, crippling debt loads, and a current account deficit that is by far the worst that we've ever had in our history. And what is this Conservative government's solution to all of the problems that they have inflicted on Canadians over the last 7 years? Well, their solution seems to be, Mr. Speaker, to move to raw bitumen exports. That somehow that will address what has been chronic mismanagement of the nation's economy for ordinary working people, the families that simply are working with a lower quality of life than what they had before. Well, Mr. Speaker, then you have to look at what the actual impacts are of this strategy for raw bitumen export. And that brings us back to the issue of Keystone. And I'd like to start, Mr. Speaker, in speaking about Keystone. In citing some of the Albertans who have raised real concerns about what the impact is of the Keystone pipeline. We're talking about a pipeline that exports raw bitumen out of the country. And what have some Albertans said about what this actually means in terms of good, well-paying, value-added jobs? Well, former Alberta Premier Ed Stelmach, who certainly seemed to understand that issue, said the following, and it's important to, I'll say this quote slowly because it's important to read into the record, Mr. Speaker. Shipping raw bitumen is like scraping off the topsoil, selling it, and then passing the farm on to the next generation. That's what Ed Stelmach said in 2006. I'll repeat that, Mr. Speaker. It's shipping raw bitumen is like scraping off the topsoil, selling it, and then passing the farm on to the next generation. That's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about creating value-added jobs. We're talking about scraping off that topsoil and then sending to the next generation a farm where there's no topsoil left. So we have basically gone through the resource. We haven't gotten the value-added jobs that should be coming with that. And yet, at the same time, we have a government that is absolutely obsessed with the idea that that is the only way for Canadians to prosper. Well, obviously, if that type of approach hasn't worked in a whole range of other sectors, Ed Stelmach is absolutely bang on in saying that this is not an appropriate response of any government that actually wants to create well-meaning value-added jobs. Now, Gil McGowan, who's president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, said the following about Keystone. What we fear is that the consequence of this particular action will be to deny Albertans literally thousands of high-paying, long-term jobs in upgraders and refineries. Every barrel of bitumen shipped down the Keystone pipeline or other similar proposed pipelines is a barrel of oil no longer available for value-added production and job creation here in Canada. And Gil McGowan, Mr. Speaker, President of the Alberta Federation of Labour, in other words, President of the Federation of Workers who work in the energy industry, said that in December 2007. So there's two Albertan voices, Mr. Speaker, saying very clearly that the idea of sending raw bitumen out of the country means that literally we are sending jobs out of the country. Now, this is a matter of real concern. Now, Mr. Speaker, as far as the figures given and the approach given by this government, I'd like to cite a few other voices. First, Robin Allen, who is a well-known economist in Western Canada, comes from Western Canada like myself, Mr. Speaker, and as well was the former CEO of the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia. Well known for her commentary on the energy sector. And what she said was the following, that chopping local downstream expansion projects, in other words, not having value added, but looking to export raw bitumen, that chopping local downstream expansion projects breaks the value-added chain. Canada's oil resources increasingly become a pool of raw crude waiting to be siphoned off along pipelines serving economic development and energy security needs of other nations. These nations are smart. They know controlling the supply chain mitigates the pain of rising oil prices. If more bitumen upgrading was undertaken where it comes out of the ground, we wouldn't need as many new pipelines. She references that about 30% less capacity is required when we're actually moving upgraded bitumen, Mr. Speaker, as opposed to exporting raw bitumen. Now, studies have been done on the Keystone pipeline. Infometrica in 2006 studied the issue of exports of raw bitumen and came to the following conclusion of the following economic analysis, that at a rate of 400,000 barrels per day of export of raw bitumen, 18,000 jobs are lost. So, Mr. Speaker, here's an indication by Infometrica that for every 100,000 barrels of raw bitumen that are exported, that we're looking at 3,000 or 4,000 jobs that are lost, that could be there in the building trades, could be there in the energy sector, could be there both in terms of upgraders and refineries as well, Mr. Speaker. So we're not talking about figures like sometimes are cited by our friends on the government side. They'll throw out studies that are promptly dismissed because, unfortunately, in each of those cases, when you look at the studies themselves, they're not credible. When we have the credible studies that show what the economic impacts are, we have simply not had from the Conservatives any understanding of what the impacts are of putting all of the eggs in the basket of raw bitumen exports. Now, the Alberta Federation of Labour also did an economic analysis that they submitted to the National Energy Board on Keystone XL. And this showed that as a result of the raw bitumen exports going through Keystone XL, that we'd be losing at least 40,000 Canadian jobs as a result of that pipeline. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's a considerable amount. When you actually think of even the growth in the energy sector, the loss of 40,000 potential jobs is extremely significant for our economic future. And so what we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, in study after study, whether it's done by Intrometrica or Robin Allen or the Alberta Federation of Labour, is that we are simply giving away a resource without putting in place the smart economic policies that allow for the value-added jobs that need to come with that resource. And whether we're talking about shutdown of Interfor in Westminster, BC, and the subsequent export of raw logs that result, or the shutting down of smelting and refining of our minerals, losing more jobs than we've gained in the mining and quarrying sector, or we talk about the export of raw bitumen, losing as a result tens of thousands of potential jobs. In every one of those cases, we're talking about ordinary families struggling to get by, struggling under phenomenally heavy debt loads that get worse every year as a result of the policies of our federal government. And we're seeing that rather than those families seeing relief, seeing in place an economic plan that actually makes sense to fully develop those resources and to have value added, instead what we see is a government hell-bent in exporting those jobs. We've seen from a number of very credible observers and analyses that obviously there is an impact. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to come back now to the issue of climate change and pipeline safety, because those are also germane to the debate that we're having today. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's an annual evaluation of how Canada is doing. It's called the Climate Change Performance Index. Now, Mr. Speaker, in 2013, out of 61 countries evaluated by the Climate Change Performance Index, where do you think Canada stood? You think Canada was in the top 20? It wasn't. The top 30? No. Top 40? No. Top 50? No. We placed 58th under this government. 58th out of 61 countries in the 2013 Climate Change Performance Index. That's not an F, Mr. Speaker. That's being thrown out of the program. That is so lamentably bad. Now, there were countries that did do worse. There were 3 of them. Kazakhstan was 59th, Iran 60th, Saudi Arabia was 61st. Now, Mr. Speaker, obviously, if what we are seeing around the world is other countries taking climate change seriously, we've got to get with the program, Mr. Speaker, and it's not just Canadians who feel that way. President Obama referenced this in connection with Keystone. He said very clearly that Canada, being a climate change laggard, actually had to start taking very concrete action on climate change and the environment. And President Obama could not have been more clear. So if Keystone is not approved, it is as a result of the failure of this government to take any sort of action on the environment and climate change. Being 58th in the world clearly shows that. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I also mentioned, in terms of pipeline safety, we've seen a doubling of the number of spills across Canada. That is of increasing concern to Canadians. So, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear to us. We believe, and our leader, the member from Outremont, leader of the official opposition, has said repeatedly, we need to put in place a national energy strategy. We need to ensure value-added production in this country. We need to ensure that we have the top levels of pipeline safety take action on climate change, of course, but also take action on the environment. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to start transitioning to clean energy. There's a $1 trillion market worldwide. That's going to double over the next decade. Canada gets very little of that. In fact, in very real terms, the hundreds of thousands of new jobs that are coming from clean energy simply are not reflected in the Canadian economy. So, folks across the country who are looking in 2015 for real leadership can look for the NDP to put in place that national energy strategy in cooperation with the provinces that will actually bring those value-added jobs and those clean energy jobs for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions.